You're watching IKTV channel 45 on your cable network. This is Unrendered, and on this edition, my guest is Professor Hilary Beckles. Professor Beckles, briefly, and I know it's very difficult to be brief on this, but in as graphic a term as you want, describe to me some of the atrocities that were committed during that slave trade. I just want you to paint that out so we can contextualize it. We can say exactly why, because of that, people were disenfranchised and still remain so today.
Well, first of all, you look at the framework of what was the transatlantic slave trade. It was the largest enforced migration of human beings in the history of the world. You are speaking about the movement against their will of about 20 million people away from their ancestral communities across an ocean and scattered across. Then you have to consider that in order to get about 20 million people to put on ships and send across the world, then you probably have to capture as many as the same amount. Because many of them are going to die in the capture process. You have to unleash warfare on their communities. You have to capture men, women, and children. You have to bring them across the land. You have to store them in warehouses. You have to store them in the ships. And then, of course, you have to get them across an ocean and take them to a place where they're going to labor. This is a horrendous undertaking, and which is why when we look at all of the crimes that have been committed on the global scale, and nobody wants to rank crimes against each other, but if you are going to rank them, what has happened to the African peoples in the last 400 years has been the greatest physical, commercial operation that constitutes a crime in the history of the world. Now, the crime has been classified as so large that it's impossible to begin to think about it in a structured way when it comes to reparations, but that is not the case. Then you have to brutalize those people in order to subjugate them into a labor situation. The first thing you have to do is to justify what you are doing. Now, if you're going to justify the enslavement of millions of people over hundreds of years, if you're going to justify that, you have to come up with a body of ideas. You have to classify them as non-human. In other words, they are deserving of their enslavement. Right. So therefore, you define them as animals, you define them as non-humans, and you define them as persons who are fitted to be treated in this way. That is your first set of atrocities. Then you have to enforce it through the brutalization of the army systems, the policing systems, and all of the other military systems of oppression. For minor transgressions, then you have to dismember them, you have to execute them, you have to take their lives. Then you have to pass laws that say, you have no legitimate right to life. No African had a right to life.
So they were subhuman, basically.
You have no right to life.
Yes.
And therefore, your life was owned by the person who purchased you. And if you are a purchased person, you're property, you're an asset, then you have no right to life, and therefore your owner can take your life at will. And that was the norm. But it's important to recognize also, too, that the legal system was developed with such sophistication to perpetuate this system that the level of evil that existed in the mind that constructed this system. Take, for example, the notion that a child was born with the status of the mother. If the mother was a slave, then the child was born a slave. If the father was a free person, the child was born free. So white men crafted that law to make sure that their offspring with black women did not come into the world as free persons to make a claim on their names or their properties or their assets. Okay. So this is skillfully designed in law.
Right.
And it is what you call a racialized system. And this is the other aspects of crime against humanity. If you target a group of people because of their ethnicity, specifically because of their ethnicity, then you have also committed a crime against humanity. Now, the only people on the planet who were reduced to chattel enslavement on a perpetual basis were the African peoples. So the system of chattel enslavement, where you were denied your human identity, you were classified as property, your status was passed on from generation to generation through the mother. You had no right to life. The only group of people on the planet who were exposed to that structure were the African peoples. So it was specific to them. They were a targeted group of people. That again suggests that the crime against humanity was specific to a targeted ethnic group. One can list all of the atrocities that followed from the structure. But from the point of view of the enslavers, this worked. This system worked. Because for 300-400 years, they were able to extract the labor out of these people to construct some of the richest economies that the world had ever seen.
Right. So I'm going to ask you, and some people argue that the Africans themselves, some of the chiefs, were actually involved in the slave trade, because how could this be possible? How could, these ships, land on the shores and capture these people without any resistance? So, first, were some of these chiefs involved? And was there a history of resistance by the blacks themselves?
Now, this is a very important point, and I'm glad you've raised it, Tony, because it's one of the mythologies that many Europeans have developed in order to justify how they were able to dominate the slave trade. The first thing is the basic one. You cannot develop and perpetuate a major international crime unless you have local support. It's impossible to develop a major global crime without some local support.
Right.
If you take, for example, the narcotics trade, the people who bring narcotics into your country to destroy your people, they cannot do it
unless there's some collaboration.
There are a few people
collaborating with them.
It cannot happen.
Yes.
But the presence of those few collaborators makes the crime even more heinous rather than less so. And you cannot then say that because you have a few collaborators,
that it's not a crime,
that the society that has been victimized has participated in the crime, or that the leadership of the country and the community of the people are in support of this because there are local collaborators. What tends to happen in all situations is that the society itself rises up against the international persons who are victimizing them, and they also rise up against the local collaborators.
Right. So was this the case?
That was the case in West Africa. In West Africa, what you have was a massive opposition and objection, massive movements against the slave trade. In all the communities across West Africa, people were fighting against this evil. They either fought directly with arms against the slave traders, they fought against their own chiefs. Occasionally, from time to time, you would have a chief who would want to survive, and to survive he has to partner. So you had all of the political situations taken on. But bear in mind that the Europeans arrive as a most powerful military force on your coast. Right along the coast of West Africa, they built these enormous forts and monuments with cannons, highly fortified. And if you look at Europe's largest export to West Africa in the 18th century, guns.
Guns, right.
So they militarized West Africa. They built these forts along the coast. They created bastions of power, and from there they sent these troops into the societies to destabilize them. Now, those governors, governments, chiefs, and kings who resisted were destroyed. A king might find himself in a position where he has to say, well, my nation will be destroyed. Can I make a deal? I would allow you to pass through my borders.
To go somebody else.
On the way to the coast, but don't take my people.
Yes.
But of course, those situations, you cannot sustain them because this trade is cannibalizing everybody else.
Right.
If you take a stance, he is destroyed, his people are captured. From time to time, a number of chiefs would come together and form a coalition. Then you would have a major war now between the governments and the people against the Europeans. Many kings were assassinated. We have a history of those kings who, by standing up against the slave traders, many of them were assassinated. So you politically destabilize West African governments. You turn governments against each other because most of the persons who were captured out of there were victims of these wars that were spawned and financed by the Europeans. So West Africa becomes a political mess. I mean, if you look at what is going on in Egypt today and some parts of the Middle East, and you see how groups against each other and the impact of arms and weapons, you know.
So that's a similar kind of destabilization
that
from an external international power. Yes.
400 years of West Africa being destabilized, and the primary product of that destabilization is labor. It is not oil, it's not minerals, it's labor. We want labor. And to get labor, we have to destroy all of these government systems, undermine them to extract the labor. Now, those who survive that could pick up their communities and migrate deep into the continent. Now, one of the interesting features of West Africa, if you drive through Nigeria, Ghana today, you will drive through valleys and so on where the populations are scantily distributed. But when you check the distribution of the population today against the historic population, and when the archaeologists do their research, here was a town 500 years ago with maybe 2-3 million people, and today it's a small village. When you do your archaeological work, you want to know what happened. An entire town pack up and go into the forest or go into the savannah.
So they were running from being captives.
Right, they're moving out.
Yes.
But if you look at human development, human beings have historically built their largest communities in valleys because the lands are fertile and you have access to water.
Right, there's a river.
Now, but at the same time, that is where you're most vulnerable. So with the slave trade and slave catchers, people who are living along the rivers and who are living in valleys are the most vulnerable people. So you have to abandon the valleys,
sitting ducks, really.
abandon the rivers, and head to the forest or into the desert.
Yes.
The result is that you are going to abandon your agricultural land. Many of the circumstances of famine that you see in Africa today
is because of that.
It's a direct result to the impact of the slave trade, which redistributed the population, the abandonment of valleys and farmlands, and people moving. So the slave trade has had some structural consequences that we continue to see in West Africa today.
Let me talk about the British themselves. In the era that we're talking about, you had people like John Locke, for example, who was an advocate of liberty and so on. There were voices, and you mentioned them in your book. Edmund Burke, I think, he was a theologian, I think. How did the British, with the presence of those voices, manage to craft these things into law? Because there were some dissenters.
Yes.
And where was people like, the great philosopher John Locke? What was his stance on this whole thing about slavery?
One of the features of human society is that when a minority interest captures control of government and define the national interests, any person, group, or institution that does not subscribe to what is seen as a national interest is brushed aside. By the middle of the 17th century, right through to the early 19th century, the slave trade and slavery were seen as in the national interest.
Right.
The government needed the revenue, the government needed the taxation, the investing class needed to make the investments, the commercial classes needed the trade and the finance from the trade, the banking system was getting the revenue, the insurance sector was insuring the slave ships. So the entire commercial economy and the political group who ran the economy defined the national interest as consistent with this business. Without slavery and the slave trade, the British economy would not grow at the rate it's growing. We need to achieve economic development. We need economic growth. This is the main investment that we are making. If you stand up against that argument and say, but, okay, but it is wrong. It is immoral. It is illegal. It is wrong. If you take that stance, then what will happen is that you are classified as either a traitor to your nation, you're subverting your nation, you're undermining your nation. So what happened in that circumstance is that those voices that took a position of moral authority were brushed aside. And you see that today in your societies all over the world. You see people who take a stand and are brushed aside because the juggernaut of the national interest is so strong.
So that takes the precedence.
That it pushes aside minority arguments about injustice, immorality, criminality, this is wrong. So there was a strong group of people in Britain who said that the slave trade is wrong, slavery is a criminal thing, we have to stop it, we have to get out of it, we cannot accept it. Those people were pushed aside. Now, John Locke found himself in the contradiction. He had built a reputation in Britain, in Europe, as a philosopher. He had formulated notions that the highest forms of government were those that celebrated liberty, those that celebrated the freedom of the individual, the right of the individual to stand against the government, dissenting voices. He was a philosopher of liberty and justice, and you know, Western Europe celebrated him for that, because what European society was concerned with was that governments were becoming so strong that there was a strong view that says individual freedom should be protected from the power of the state.
Right.
You must remember, you know, that Europe was still in the process of executing people left, right, and center without proper trials and so on. You know, you express a view against the king or against an aristocrat.
The monarchical system.
Yes, and
committed murders.
yes. So philosophers who spoke about the primacy of human liberty were celebrated. Now, you move now to bring the slavery system into that mechanism. And Locke was caught in the contradiction. His philosophy celebrated human rights, human liberty.
Right.
At the same time, he is a middle-class property owner who needs to make his own personal fortune.
Right.
So he ended up investing in the slave trade. He was the corporate secretary for the first British slave trade company, the Royal African Company. He was the corporate secretary. He owned stock, he owned slaves. He was an investor in the slavery economy in the Bahamas. So he's a slave trader, he is a slave owner, but he's also a philosophy of liberty.
Right.
Now, how does he justify that? He justifies that by saying there is no contradiction. The Africans are not humans.
So he himself bought into the
So
notion.
since the Africans are not humans,
Yes.
they cannot participate in the philosophy that I'm exposing about justice, liberty, and freedom.
Right.
Because I am speaking about human freedom, human
Not about
liberty.
subhuman people.
And these people are subhuman, so
Yes.
therefore they do not represent the subjects that I am speaking about. So that was a sleight of hand which he used. Thus, of course, discrediting his own philosophy in the process.
Well, we've overrun the second segment, but that's fair enough. When we come back, I want us to look at the role of the church in this whole practice of the slave trade, and the church and the monarchy.
Yes.
And you know, let's deal with that when we come back. This is Unrendered on IKTV. My guest is Professor Hilary Beckles. More when we come back.